Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation called Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration. My name is Jason Nguyen, and I'm an assistant professor here at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are all grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This evening's event, featuring the initiators, editors, and authors of a project called Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration, marks the launch and celebration of a collection of articles on the themes of migration, architecture, and feminism in 3 open access online journals. To tell us more about those journals, the essay project, and the collaborative nature of the work are the first of tonight's speakers, Anooradha Iyer Siddiqi and Rachel Lee. Anooradha is an assistant professor at Columbia University's Barnard College and the author of the upcoming book, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camp and Humanitarian Settlement, which is about the history, epistemologies, spatial politics, and visual rhetoric of the UNHCR-administered camps in northeastern Kenya. She is also completing a book on the heritage politics and critical heritage practices in Sri Lanka based on the work of Minette de Silva, one of the first women in the world to establish an architectural practice as sole principle. Rachel Lee, meanwhile, is based at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at TU Delft in the Netherlands. Her work is largely focused on understanding how migration intersects with the built environment. Rachel's most recent work on exile will be published in the upcoming co-edited volume, Urban Exile: Theories, Methods, Research Practices. As a Mellon Fellow with the Canadian Centre for Architecture's Centering Africa project, she is also studying Lipsmeyer and Partners' contribution to social infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. Please join me in welcoming Anooradha and Rachel.
Thank you, Jason, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for welcoming us here. The way the lighting works, we can't quite see you, but we're just very happy to be in this room with you. Shall I begin, or you want to say hello?
No, but I hope at the end of the presentation that we can have the lights up and have a really engaging Q&A.
Yeah, exactly. So we are going to lay out a little bit of a complicated landscape with you. And again, we really invite you in to tell us what you think about all this. But we want to begin by talking about a few themes related to feminist architectural histories of migration. We want to start by talking about collaboration. This has been a years-long project between what began with the 2 of us and has turned into many persons and many objects and many histories that we've been chasing around the world, hand in hand with lots of people who have come into the process at various points over the past, I think we said 8 years. We ourselves started this project and have had our own trajectories through it, our own professional and trajectories and otherwise. So in some ways, our method has really reflected the condition of migration in a lot of different ways. Do you want to talk about the next thing?
And carrying on with the ideas behind collaboration, I think maybe it's something that in architecture schools is quite apparent. I teach at TU Delft, and there the emphasis is quite often on group work. And although the students all really get a lot out of the group work through the exchanges, they're also sometimes a little frustrated because they feel that the group work and the collaborations involved in that take a lot more time. And that's something that we also think that our collaboration has really valued, actually. Anu mentioned that we've been working on this for 8 years, and we think it is important that sometimes collaborations should be encouraged, even although they may take a little longer than individual works. In architectural history, which is the sort of field that we both belong to, the emphasis has really been on single-authored projects for a long time. And with our project, we wanted to push against that. There's also, within the academic realm, kind of a pressure to produce as much work as possible towards forwarding your career. And this is a project which we have really labored on intensely over this time, and the time that we have invested in it and the other authors have invested in this has really been a very generative process, and it's something that we would like to also put in the foreground, that sometimes collaboration takes time.
It is ultimately an anti-capitalist strategy. And just to show you one of the images from the collection, we used this as an image to really talk about collaborations. And this was a protest site where people were working with children to make objects to be used in a protest. Some of what we started to do as part of over the course of this project also was to think about how you write architectural histories, thinking about migrant spaces and spaces of mobility, which forces us to think differently about what architecture even is, that perhaps it isn't the stable buildings that we expect to find at the end of a process. Should we move on to the next thing? So the project has unfolded over the course of time in 3 online journals. And the journals are very different in character, and we're very fortunate today to have editors with us from each of the journals and people who really participated in the writing process. They're all open access journals, and so some of what we were really trying to think about is how to make knowledge accessible, how to make deep scholarship accessible to a wider public, accessible in terms of digital access, which isn't always accessible in all parts of the world, but also accessible in terms of the way things are written. So a lot of what we experimented with, we'll be showing you down the line, is really how to play with the publication format.
And the images that you see here both come from our own work and kind of also underline the nature of our research, which has taken us to different places around the world. But rather than thinking about our projects or this project as going towards sort of a global history, we really want to underline the importance of seeing it as a connected history. Anu and I when we met in 2014, we were both working on different projects that took us to different parts of the world, but our paths intersected in quite meaningful ways, which also generated this project. And although we came from very different parts of the world, somehow we were connected through these ideas. And so our aim was also to, through this project, connect histories through the authors and these different publication platforms and the different formats that those platforms offer.
Yeah, so some of what we wanted to show is the ways that a painting painted by a Somali artist in Africa might be connected to another image from 1949 that is representing a very different art history. We've also really thought about how to put authors together across the world, and we'll show you that in a moment. what are we going to talk about next? Feminism.
Yes.
So the other kind of significant aspect of the project is the aspect of feminism, and for that we use this example of an archival project. Rachel is talking about how we found ourselves intersecting in different parts of the world, but what she's really referring to is that although we were traversing paths in Africa and Asia, we were finding that we were in some of the very same difficult to find archives, or in some of the very same difficult to find conversations, working on pretty different projects. One of the places that we intersected was Bombay, and it has one of the oldest schools of architecture in the world, and this was from one of the student journals back in those days. It's a really wonderful drawing about how women should not become architects.
So with that in mind, we decided to center feminism with this collection. So in two different ways. Part of the feminism does involve sort of centering women's histories that may have been overlooked or erased from the sort of more canonical histories that you may have been taught in architecture school. So there is a recuperative aspect to the project, but then there's also taking different kinds of feminist approaches to writing architectural histories that go beyond centering women and foreground other methods. And we feel that centering migration does the same kind of, it forces us to look at the instabilities and the lack of fixity that really constitutes architecture, although we tend to think of it in a very different way generally.
The feminist project and feminist theory in a broader sense began with an approach in which forms and theories would be bracketed, and the feminist view was to create a perspective from the outside. This, we feel, is part of what happens through the process of migration. A migrant is forced to see things from the outside. When we looked at a lot of women's practices, for example, we were often seeing that they weren't involved in landed architecture, and their histories were not, or their archives were somehow not landed either. They form a kind of outsider position. So we started by thinking about how people inhabit the margins, and we've come to this approach of really understanding that a lot of these practices form themselves through collaboration. Because they're collaborative, they don't end in creating signature architectures. And it's the signature that we have often found in the histories. And collaborations tend to efface people's individual names and individual achievements. What we're trying to do in this project is spotlight another way of thinking about that.
So yesterday, the final installment of our three-part collection, which, as we mentioned before, is also on 3 different online platforms, launched, the title of it being On Collaborations. And shall we move to the videos now? Yeah. So in the next section, 2 of the authors that have contributed to the collection will briefly present their work. And we're going to present now 2 readings of excerpts from their work to give you a flavor of their work before the authors present them themselves.
On Contradictions, the Architecture of Women's Resistance and Emancipation in Early 20th Century Iran by Armaghan Ziaee. Interestingly, in this climate of limited mobility and restrictions, For many veiled women who still lived in old neighborhoods, the vernacular, organic Iranian urban form of narrow, partly roofed alleys and linked architecture became the women's tool of resistance against modernity and state power. For example, one of the main needs of women during this period was using the public bathhouses hammam. In traditional Iranian architecture, due to many limitations such as access to water and or lack of urban plumbing, houses did not have baths. Although private baths and plumbing were gradually became part of the modern architecture of Iranian houses, in older districts and poor neighborhoods, public hammams were still the only way for men and women to bath. Soon after the Unveiling Act was announced, the state mandated that hammams could no longer allow veiled women to use their facilities and threatened to penalize hammam owners who violated this law. However, as a form of solidarity, many male hammam owners allowed veiled women to use their baths. This can be observed as an intersection where women's individual rights overlap with their community's acts of resistance, and where new gender relations are discursively created.
Hello, everyone.
Sorry. Before we bring the author onto the screen, we really just want to explain some of what we really wanted to do was create a reception bed for this work. So we'll meet the author in a moment of this essay. The person who just spoke was the reader of the essay. We made a small film of people reading the works. And I think Armaghan is with us on Zoom.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thanks everyone for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to use this opportunity and similarly read 3 excerpts from my article. But before I begin, I just want to give you a quick context, the history about Iran, the history of women's rights and their freedom in Iran, as it intersects with modernization, nationalism, and fundamentalism is among the complex and contradictory ones. Throughout centuries and despite enormous inside and outside challenges, including the geopolitical location of Iran, Iranian women have had an important history of resistance and activism in which they fought for their rights and freedom, even from the most marginalized spaces that were given to them. So here is the first one. Historically, in Iran, there had been a clear distinction between masculine public spaces and feminine private spaces. Streets, squares, and shops were all considered masculine. When women left the feminine space and privacy of the home and entered the masculine public world, they were obligated to wear the veil and conceal their bodies. Most women's outside activity was limited to socializing among neighbors, relatives, and kin, or to carrying out religious rituals. The goal of the modern democratization of public spaces was to reduce this gender segregation. The second one. Public spaces became elements of modern micropolitics and biopolitics in which Iranian women's bodies were subjugated, disciplined, and controlled through the measurement and surveillance of the state. Modern public spaces, in this sense, served as a liminal space of acceptance and resistance that reproduced inclusion and exclusion and challenged hegemonic and counter-hegemonic normative views on gender, class, ethnicity, and religion. This liminal space was shaped by gender and helped constitute gender and other social relations as exemplified in the modern architecture movement in Iran, which helped determine how public spaces became gendered sites of domination and subordination, yet also trains of resistance and transformation. This is the third one. This paper attempts to serve not only as an intellectual intervention in a long scholarly trajectory about modern architecture in Iran and the Middle East, but also as a form of advocacy which encourages architects and scholars, particularly from Iran and the Middle East, to become more aware of their roles when writing their histories. Other than the actual stories of women we try to narrate, our positionality and standpoint as feminist architectural historian and methods we use to historicize the production and consumption of spaces, including how women embrace and or resist these spaces, is itself significant for social justice. In our responsibility to write histories of actors shaping the built environment outside the traditional boundaries of discipline, we contribute to the accounts of modern architecture regionally and transnationally by making the histories of disenfranchised and marginalized groups visible. To end, I want to highlight the importance of the work that Anooradha and Rachel did and how their work brought together all our scholarship, stories, and voices we narrate or we share. Because part of being an ally, advocate, or in solidarity is caring enough about everyone in this world when we see any form of injustice. And I believe feminist architectural histories of migration connected us in the diaspora and provided us with an opportunity to share stories of those voices that needed to be centered. Thank you.
Thank you, Armaghan.
Thank you so much, Armaghan.
So we have the second video. We have the great fortune to have the next author with us here on stage, and you know her very well. We'll play another video of someone reading her work.
My name is Esra.
No, it's the other video. The second.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Nida Rahman, and I'm going to read a passage from The Nail House of the Sengtang Girl, Exile and Migration in China's Modern City by Juan. Self-built village houses, illegal but commonplace in urbanizing China, offer a rare example of an indigenous population directly participating in the construction of the new city. This phenomenon deconstructs the widely accepted theory that Shenzhen's success can be attributed entirely to its master plan. The history of Zhang's village house presents an alternative perspective on the city's growth and reveals how the architecture of Shenzhen's urban villages were central to modernization. The urban villagers and their towers have nevertheless long been portrayed as Zhang, Luan, Cha, dirty, messy, poor quality, and antithetical to the gleaming image the city has of itself. The stigma extends to the term nail house, a stubborn object that should be forcibly pried out. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the first time I heard the reading. No, it's also strange it's also the first time in my life to hear my text read by someone else out loud like that. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Juan, and I also just like to say a big welcome on behalf of the faculty. I'm uniquely playing a double role today, being a co-host, but also being one of the contributing writers to this great project that you have been presented. So as what was indicated a bit in the reading of the text, the protagonist of the narrative that I have written is a village woman. Her name is Zhang Lianhao. She's a woman migrant that turned villager owner of China's so-called most expensive nail house. And she made a brief appearance in my book, The Shenzhen Experiment, The Story of China's Instant City. In the book, I explored Shenzhen's regional and rural past, as well as its modern urbanization, weaving together its complex social and spatial histories with personal narratives of migration, success, and struggles. Stories that have been obscured in the myth-making around China's much-hyped model city. Amongst the dozens of individuals featured in the book, Zhang Lianhao's relationship with the city was the most dramatic, controversial, and provocative. So when I was invited by Anooradha and Rachel to contribute to this great project 2.5 years ago, I decided to elaborate a bit more on her story for this series. In 2006, a nail house was demolished to make way for KK100, a 100-story luxury commercial tower designed by the British architect Sir Terry Farrell. And the nail house, I don't know if you can see, the nail house that was demolished is this one right here. This is, I believe, the subject matter nail houses has been in the Western press, I guess in North America a few years ago. So hopefully that's not foreign to everyone. But while in the Western media, nail houses were presented, the people that are the owners and the stories behind the nail houses, the individuals who made them, who really resisted removal, eviction, demolition, and displacement are rarely featured, if at all. So in this case, this is the effort that I have tried to do to really very much recuperate that aspect, to really show the human story that is behind rapid urbanization. So I'm not sure how many of you know Shenzhen. It's right located just north of the border from Hong Kong. The map above is a CIA mapping of Shenzhen's territory in the 1940s and 50s, and below is a satellite image of the 2000s. And this transformation took this rural region from a population of 300,000 to 20 million. So that transformation has resulted in a very beautiful, modern, planned and designed city. But one of the phenomena that's been hidden from most narratives are the urban villages, which were indigenous villages that also urbanized at the same time as the city. And the majority of the buildings in the urban villages are these type of villager-built housing, villager-built homes. And this is a process of demolition of that particular village that this nail house is from, if you recognize it. And in the background of, in the context of surrounding these urban villages are these towers that should not be too unfamiliar. And in the Chinese city, as very much as many other cities, there was a race to design the tallest, biggest, and highest buildings. However, the history of the city very much was written by towers as much as by the humble village home that started out in the 80s as a single story, eventually made way for higher buildings. And it is this humble housing typology. Not only did it make the rapid urbanization possible in Shenzhen, it still houses 50% of the city's population today. As in, out of 20 million, 10 million lives in these self-built villager homes. And that transformation, the urban transformation process was extremely rapid and spatially unprecedented, I would say, in the history of urbanization, because the rate and scale of urbanization in terms of building construction and population growth was unprecedented. This is an image of showing why it's called nail houses. It's usually the lone building that still remains after all of the other buildings around it has been demolished. And that building, and that whole neighborhood was demolished in order to build this. This is a 5-star St. Regis luxury hotel tower. It has won many, many design awards around the world. The scale of that transformation from architectural perspective and urbanistic perspective can perhaps be illustrated slightly in this drawing to really show the impacts of a city that very quickly, of any city, Toronto included, when facing demolition and gentrification. And so what was built was yet another tower in 2011 to add to the line of quite innovative tower constructions in China. So they has resulted, this is a tower that's been built 2 years ago that is vastly taller than the one that was built in 2011. And what I wanted to be able to really to present is that while the image of the modernized Chinese city or the modernized cities around the world might look like this, the reality is that the neighborhoods that look like this are equally as important, if not more, and of significant historical, architectural, and social importance to the history of the city and the history of the country. Because it is in these villages that lives are made affordable, accessible, and communities remain to be constructed in ways that has been for centuries. When demolitions like this happen, very often the lone resistance, the individuals who are lone resistant face tremendous harassment, persecution, and vilified by everyone in the city, in the public, in the media as being greedy and resistant to the collective well-being of the city. Zhang Linhao's personal story reflects the urban existence of hundreds of millions of rural migrants in China's rapidly urbanized cities, and that is still happening. It offers a rare glimpse into the largely untold and under-examined present-day consequences of both China's recent sit-down movement, which I elaborate a bit more in the article, not right now because this is too complex to cover in the short time we have, but as well as the widespread evictions of building owners and renters. Zhang's personal narrative provides an allegory of the city's history and symbolizes the massive changes that took place in China during these past decades of rapid urbanization and extreme densification. In the story of Shenzhen's urbanization, Zhang Linhao is both unique in her defiance of what seemingly were unstoppable forces and also symbolizes the many people displaced by these forces. I would like to present she is as much a part of the city's architectural and urban history as its gleaming towers. Thank you very much.
I think we see in these two examples of texts from this set of articles and essays, whether from the early part of the 20th century in Iran or a much more recent history in Shenzhen, we're seeing the ways that migration can be used as both a way to speak of the content of history, but also various methods. We can really use migration as a way to conceptualize histories and ways to tell histories. What we had hoped to do with this collection was create a scaffold so that more people could tell stories about migration within the context of architectural history. Architectural history has traditionally really focused on very fixed structures. And as part of creating a space for us to tell stories that aren't just about fixed structures, we started thinking about publication formats that would allow us to create a kind of virtual structure to hold these histories. We were very fortunate over time to have the opportunity to work with 3 publishers who really wanted to think experimentally with us. It is very difficult to publish architectural historical scholarship. It takes many years. It takes sometimes as many years as it takes to build a building. We were allowed to these different editors worked with us in ways to create a kind of stability around these narratives. So we're very fortunate today to have representatives from the 3 publications with us. We'll be hearing first from, and they're all digital publishers who do open access publication. So we'll be hearing first from 2 of the editors from Aggregate, and we would really recommend that you look at that website. It was the 3rd of the publications that launched just yesterday, and it holds the full table of contents for the collection. We're very fortunate to have the managing editor here in the audience with us. We will then hear from an editor from the Canadian Centre for Architecture, who's with us today. And finally, we'll have some words from an editor from the 3rd journal called Architecture Beyond Europe. She is unfortunately ill and can't be with us, but she sent us some words to read. So I'll invite Pamela and Meredith to speak. And they are joining us on Zoom.
Meredith, would you like me to start? Okay, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having us for this amazing event. I want to start by saying a few words about Aggregate. Aggregate has started its collaboration back in 2006. In 2012, exactly 10 years ago, the collective was officially registered as a nonprofit organization. Since then, the platform is dedicated to advancing research and education in the history and theory of architecture and related areas. Through workshops and presentations, Aggregate generates open peer-reviewed articles, and these articles are often published in 2 main forms: in edited volumes printed by academic presses and on our online platform, which is spearheaded by Dr. Meredith TenHoor and materialized thanks mostly to the efforts of Dr.to-be Elliot Sturtevant. Because of the unquestionably time-consuming processes that the printed press entails, our online publications are often dedicated to topics that need urgent attention. Most dossiers or projects that we've produced are presented in the form of what I'd like to call the scholarship of activism, because, as Anu aptly mentioned, these online projects are accessible, widely accessible in fact, and also because they're often timely. Soon after the murder of Trayvon Martin and the whole host of Black Lives Matter protests that occurred because of that brutal killing, Aggregate Online published the Black Lives Matter dossier. At the height of ISIS attack on the cultural heritage and architectural monuments of the Middle East, we published the Destruction dossier. The environmental impacts of architecture and landscape were addressed in the Toxics dossier at a time when climate concerns among the youth led them to go as far as attacking canonical landscape art in prestigious museums. I'm thrilled that the current dossier on the significance of feminism in architectural history and spatial activism is published in the aftermath of the Me Too movement and at a time when we are witnessing an ongoing bold and brave female-led upheaval in Iran, or what Robin Wright of The New Yorker has called the first counter-revolution led by women in the world. Significantly, the movement in Iran is not an upheaval by women, but one that is about women. And it is one that is centered on critical spatial practices through which women move in and out of their comfort zones to repeatedly challenge the morality police. Just earlier today, social media feeds were animated by images from Tehran metro stations where surveillance cameras were shown to be covered by tampons, all done swiftly on the ground by anonymous women activists. Rather than being isolated and insular, these feminist spatial practices are important and relevant for all of us. in this interconnected world. Indeed, feminism, with all its forms, including intersectional feminism, as a movement, constantly evolves to teach us something new, not only about women's rights, but also about human rights, not only about a room of one's own, but also about a spatial justice for all. Women of Iran have shown us this, and so do the brave women in history and architectural history, as the brilliant authors of this dossier have so caringly demonstrated. And on behalf of Aggregate, I'd like to congratulate them all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. That was really amazing. I'll just speak for a second about our review practices in Aggregate. In Aggregate, we practice something called transparent peer review. It's face-to-face, collaborative, constructive review practices that happen really before work is finalized, when ideas are still flexible and mobile, and where feedback is actually helpful rather than the stereotypical reviewer number 2 who says you can't do X, Y, and Z. Aggregate has considered itself primarily a host for collaborative projects rather than single-authored papers for the past 9 or so years. And so transparent peer review in the context of a project like this one also has the advantage of creating early linkages between people in different peer review groups. While anonymous peer review can tend to protect people from gatekeeping in large fields, and in those senses it can sometimes serve feminist ends, we feel that in fields as small as ours, face-to-face engagement often held a possibility for more collaborative, supportive means of producing scholarship, shifting us away from notions of individuals as sole producers of discourses towards acknowledgements of collective knowledge from many disciplines upon which we build our work. I'm really grateful to the authors in Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration for engaging in this process with us, and especially to Anu and Rachel for bringing us this project and so gracefully handling the occasionally annoying and slow sides to transparent peer review, which often, involve a lot of conversation and deliberation and back and forth, moving us, as Pamela says, in and out of comfort zones. I think this dossier has also taught Aggregate a lot, and for that I'm extremely grateful, teaching us how we can shift some of our practices of transparent peer review to more explicitly feminist ends, and I'm really excited for that to filter into projects to come. So thank you so much, everyone who's participated in this project. It's really an honor to get to share your work, and thank you to Elliot Sturdivant, who's care and maintenance of the Aggregate website, alongside of his own scholarship, has really made this possible.
Thank you so much, Pamela and Meredith. I'd now like to welcome Alexandra Pereira-Edwards from the Canadian Centre for Architecture's publication.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I just wanted to start by saying thank you to everyone who helped organize this event, and especially to Anooradha and Rachel for facilitating this really important project. So today I'm going to talk about how the CCA sort of intersects with this project as a platform, but maybe first as a background, I'll give a little bit of an overview of the CCA as an online publisher. So we publish articles every week, and sometimes we group these articles in sort of thematic sections that we refer to as issues. So the Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration project found its way onto the CCA website as an issue called Of Migration. And the issues we treat almost more like a journal publication that follow a sort of particular theme. So when it came to publishing this project on the CCA website, I think, and I'll borrow a lot from Anooradha and Rachel here in my explanation of this, but I think it was a lot about this concept of diffraction, thinking about how people, places, and things get diffracted through migration, and sort of this idea of disrupting a singular narrative about the built environment. So as Anooradha said earlier tonight, migration became considered as a method for producing space, but also a lens through which to understand the built environment. And the project on the CCA site was really loosely oriented around 4 themes, but I think all of the contributions to the issue really sort of wove into all of them. But those themes are representation, materiality, space, and memory. But I think the other interesting thing about the CCA website output of this project was that it was really an experimentation with different forms of media. So all of the contributions to the issue contained at least one image of some sort, whether that was a drawing by the author of the article or about the article's subject. In one case, a documentary film, archival imagery, photographs. And I think this mix of media really allowed us as a publishing platform to sort of expand how we were approaching our own publishing practices. We also published audio recordings of all of the authors reading their pieces. So there was a level of humanity, I think, that comes with that output, and it really did shift how we approached the website. And in thinking through what I was going to say in this very kind of short window of time, I thought back to a quote from Anooradha and Rachel's introduction on the Aggregate website, and I'll paraphrase here. So while the project is sort of against or a critique of these narratives of fixity, it's important to note that all of the platforms that it was published on do find themselves centered in sort of an epistemic north, and therefore in this hierarchy of cultural production. And while this does evidence a particular structure, it doesn't necessarily imply that structure's stability. So I think this was something that is really important to consider for the CCA as a cultural institution, a settler cultural institution. And so I just want to talk about two projects that are happening at the CCA right now that I think do speak to how we're trying to sort of uproot ourselves or our position within this cultural hierarchy. So the first is another web issue that we're currently publishing called Figuring Territory. And what's interesting about this issue is that it was the first instance of the CCA doing an open call for abstracts to publish on our website, whereas typically we would approach or solicit different authors or academics or architects to contribute something to the web. With Figuring Territory, we were really hoping to expand the scope of work that we publish and really open ourselves up to new narratives and new formats for publication. So we've published a guided meditation, which is a new angle that I don't think any of the editors would have thought of. Guided meditation, we're going to be publishing an illustrated fiction, sound pieces, and really just sort of broadening the voices that we're including on the website, but also the publication formats that we're encouraging and allowing space for. And the second project I'll touch on just very quickly, it's the current main gallery exhibition that we have at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And if you're not aware, maybe, the CCA has two sort of main gallery spaces that always have a rotating exhibitions, and we also have that's kind of in parallel to the publishing format. So this main gallery exhibition is called Towards Home, and in the new year it will also be published as a print publication. The exhibition and publication are both centered around Indigenous conceptions of home in the circumpolar north. And I think something that is really important about this project and sort of operating in parallel to the Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration project is that it's co-curated by a group of co-curators, one settler co-curator from the CCA and 3 Northern Indigenous co-curators that I think were not necessarily invited into an existing conversation, but importantly, were invited to guide the conversation. And I think that, it's important for the CCA to continue to question its position within this sort of cultural hierarchy. And I think a lot of that questioning was maybe born from our collaboration with this project or happening in parallel to it. And so just to kind of share maybe some final words, I think this spirit of collaboration was very much alive in our publishing of this project. And I think it wouldn't have been able to have happened if not for the kindness and trust between all of the collaborators. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm going to read from a text that Tanya Sengupta, who is one of the editors from ABE Journal-Architecture Beyond Europe, sent to us today. As Anu mentioned, she isn't able to attend in person, but she did share her thoughts with us, so I'm going to read from those. She says, It actually meant a lot to me that this issue was the first one to come out after I joined the ABE Journal. ABA's core interest in architectural built environment histories, global geographies, transnational exchanges and mobilities, of course, provided a natural ground for the stories of architectural production and experience through confinement, mobilities, and migrations across borders and frontiers, and in this instance, mainly of or by female and or marginal protagonists, individually or collectively. She continues, I think this issue was immensely significant, equally because it marked a substantive augmentation or even shift in terms of the trajectory and orientation of the journal itself. Some of the foundational hierarchies, for example, the diffusion, the center-periphery model, direction of flow, protagonists featured, the architecture journals are often willy-nilly entangled in, of course, take long to rework. And the issue on feminist architectural histories of migration definitely represented a very meaningful step for the ABE by introducing not only newer protagonists, but also feminist values and paradigms at the intersection of architecture, migration, and margins. The focus on resituated knowledge and experience is key, as it helps shift architecture's vantages and subject positions. The focus on destabilizing fixity through charting mobile, transient, and nomadic worlds is one of the most profound paradigm shifts, given architectures and architectural histories anchorage in and complicity with fixed, stable locations and material, substantial, and sound objects. It enables journals like ABE to enhance their own worlds and who they speak for and to. The fact that this was a multi-sited, open access endeavor also shows us interesting and effective ways of building global communities of shared concerns, values, and affect. And she goes on to say she goes on to specify a few of the things that shifted within the publication. That the ABE journal is quite a traditional publication in the sense that it includes certain sections that Aggregate and the CCA don't so much do. So the articles, one of which was Armaghan's, were complemented by other types of writing. So Kathleen James Chakraborty reviewed Hilda Heinen's book on Sybil Moholy-Nagy, and Mary Pipchinsky commented on Simone de Beauvoir's 1948 publication, America Day by Day. ABE also managed to question their own restrictions in terms of word count for articles, and introduce some malleability to absorb different formats. So Sophie Hochhäusel's paper, Dear Comrade, or Exile in a Communist World, Resistance, Feminism, and Urbanism in Margareta Schutte-Lehotzky's work in China, 1934-1956, was much longer than the usual length of journal articles, but they were happy to provide the space for this expansive enunciation. And the third section, which was also part of the collection, outside of the full-length articles, was the documents section, where the archives of the French-Algerian architect Georgette Cotin-Uzol, who was one of the first female architects in France as well as Algeria, was presented. So it was interesting for ABE to experiment across the whole format of the journal with this project. Thank you.
On stage as well as on the screen. There were a number of things that I found really fascinating about this, and I should say that should anybody have questions or would like to participate in this, certainly raise your hand. And I think there are people roaming around, so we can try to engender a conversation as opposed to, the hierarchy, if you will. I guess there were a few things that I found really fascinating that seemed to come up across all of the presentations. I guess I grouped them in my mind and on this piece of paper in front of me in 3 categories. One was about just the politics of collaboration as it kind of manifests both in scholarship, in publications, and also as a form of advocacy. The second was about methods of migration or about studying migration. I think you raised a number of issues about, challenges to issues of fixity, but of course Juan kind of references where fixity itself is a kind of form of exile within a kind of gentrifying and changing city. I do have actual questions with this, but maybe we can, I'll just give an overview of some of my interests. And the last was really just about the question of subjecthood and maybe positionality. I saw in a number of, the question of subjecthood, right, it emerges through the discussions of feminism, certainly, and some of the stories that are being told, certainly, I guess, gesturing to questions of methods, different kind of ways of doing research, whether it's through ethnography or thinking about typology or otherwise. I thought one of the things that was really fascinating with just the reading out of of the articles that exist on the website is that there seems to be, how do you relate to subjecthood and positionality? That is like the position of the person whose story you're telling, and how do those things perhaps relate, and how might this kind of collaborative process maybe open up doors for that? I was thinking of the CCA exhibition about home, where there is a kind of collaborative form within the exhibition framework to kind of not take the place of someone else's positionality, but offer like a platform for that conversation. So at any rate, those were the I do have actual questions that go along with this, but maybe just the first one, speaking about the politics of collaboration. I was kind of curious what you feel collectively, what this kind of collaboration makes possible, not only for scholarship, it certainly that opens up a lot of doors, but also presses against a lot of institutional norms that exist within either the academy or otherwise. Questions of communication, professions and professionalization, as well as the politics of this, collaboration as a kind of form of advocacy, and how, here we're scholars on stage, I suppose, but also, we are kind of trying to think about the design practices as well, and that was stated by you, Rachel, at the very beginning about the collaborative nature of design practice. So I guess maybe I'll ask that first thing and see if you guys have thoughts on that.
Sorry, Jason, can you reiterate that? I was pouring the water and was not fully concentrating on the question.
I guess what you think, just maybe simply what you think collaboration makes possible. We certainly see where it is a kind of critique of institutional norms that exist. And I think some of the things that makes possible are just the online platforms that you've published in, but maybe just as what it means for scholarship to be collaborative, what it might mean for design, what it might mean for communication, and what it means for like the politics of our field.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mentioned at the beginning that architectural design school, at least the one that I'm working at in Delft, puts an emphasis on group work and collaboration through most of the master's program, but in the final year of the master's graduation project, it shifts back to individual design work. So it's there, but it's, in the end, it has to, the graduation is done as an individual process. I think, there's something to be said about that. And in other disciplinary fields outside of the humanities, outside of architectural history and outside of art history, collaborative publication is the absolute norm. And we see on some papers, up to, sometimes 5 authors, sometimes 10 authors, where people really work together in labs and produce this kind of collaborative scholarship. But for many years in architectural history, I think it has not been the norm at all. And it's something that that is a feminist practice, I would say, or working collaboratively. And that we really try to embrace that. And it's something that perhaps was not, that wasn't so something that I was so consciously doing in my own practice, but now I have really embraced that, and projects going forward will be collaborative projects. So I think I hope that's something that we can take up and continue working with. What you were saying about subjecthood and the relation between the authors and the subjects about whom they were writing. I think in the introduction we also talk about having a sense of solidarity with the migrants who we're working with, whose lives and works we're putting at the center of these explorations. I think that's another thing that goes beyond sort of typical architectural historical scholarship, just to really stand in solidarity with those people.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just add that, there are 23 articles in this collection, or we might say 24 if you count a film that was made really almost in the last 2 weeks, of people who came out of the woodwork to choose excerpts from each article, read them, and one of the authors very generously gave of much of his time to put together a film of these readers reading these works. So, we've all seen edited volumes, but it's quite a thing to have edited readership and to have a body of readers who all in solidarity somehow said that it's important enough that we all need to gather around this project and, not just write the project, but read the project. It is, as Rachel said, a big deal to have written the project, and each of the authors in different ways are writing about migrants. One thing I think we can possibly all agree on about architectural history, as it has traditionally been housed in the academy, is it has been a colonial discipline. It's really been a masculinist discipline. It has for a long time been about writing about famous architects or writing about buildings or structures in history that have a lot of structural support. It hasn't really been about writing about precarious people, precarious lives, and things that are so precarious that they can't even really be called architecture. So I think that the authors have to be commended for, in many cases, finding these histories. One of the authors on our stage is one of these people who really, against all odds, searched for and found a history of one woman. And in many cases, these were histories of people and events that were either specifically buried or silenced, or they were really just made invisible because of what happened around them. The authors alone, I think, should be really commended for putting this together. As we went through the process over these many years, we also started to realize that the more that we were working on this, the more people wanted to gather around this. There's a reason for that. And so I think we had this massive demonstration in the last couple of weeks of people who also were willing to give of their time. They're very busy academics who were willing to give of their time and do short readings, read an article, choose an excerpt. It was a very loving way, I think, for this collection to come out. That's a politics.
Yeah, for sure.
Perhaps I can add to that from an author's perspective of how working on this particular text has been a very, very different process of writing and editing from, say, when I was working on my book, which, for those who write, it's got to be the loneliest act in the world. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, really for architects and designers to write, because we are used to working very collaboratively, whether it was in the training at the studio and later in practice. So for me to go from practice and then into research, history, theory, and writing, that was one of the biggest differences I've noticed. But as an author who was invited to participate in this, I participated in the transparent, what was called transparent peer review process, where I read other authors' texts, I gave comments, and I received comments and suggestions and recommendations from my fellow authors as well as the editors. And I have to say that I've never encountered this in my previous writing projects. Yes, it did take up a lot longer time in terms of the actual production and discussions and such, but I really do believe that both my spirit in writing it and the text itself are much better for it. So I have found that this was a really fascinating process of collaboration. And I should note that when I was first invited to contribute to this, I was in Hong Kong. I had no idea that 2.5 years later I would be in Toronto. And when I was in Hong Kong and speaking, I think Rachel was in Europe. Anooradha, you were in India, I think, at the time. And some of the other fellow authors was in different countries. So it was not only just collaboration between writers, editors, it was very much a international collaboration of people coming from different areas and different subject matters and covering subject matters that typically have not been at the center or mentioned at all in the typical canons of architecture and urban history. And the support through the collaboration has really helped to validate some of our own personal struggles in thinking maybe no one's interested. And that process, I think, for a lot of whether it's students or young scholars, when you're working on a project, that's kind of the greatest fear, right? You spend hundreds of thousands of hours on something, you're like, maybe no one's interested in this at all. So when the comments, critical comments came back to have to rewrite certain things, but equally encouraging comments like, this is such a fantastic story. I have never seen anything that existed that spoke about the individuals behind, for example, in my case, the modernization and urbanization of China. So in all of the coverages of, say, nail houses, even as a small trope, no one has ever spoke about why they became nail houses and what happened to those individuals once those nail houses inevitably were demolished. So to have had kind of support, emotional support, as well as architectural and technical support was really, really important. And I want to thank all of the organizers, the editors, to understand that this is quite, I think, an interesting method to really rethink about how we work.
Can I add something to that? Yeah, I mean, just for those of you who may not know scholarly processes of publication, and I think for us, for Rachel and me, it was really important to work with multiple journals who use multiple methods. And Meredith described this kind of open peer review process as Aggregate's process. Architecture Beyond Europe, the first journal that we worked with, it has a much more conservative process. It's much more like a print journal that made its way online, but it really replicated the print processes, which use a blind peer review process. And often, an author will submit an article. The article will be sent out to 2 people to review it. The review will come back. It's all anonymous. The reviewers don't know who the author is. The author doesn't know who the reviewers are. But there are little things that happen in these processes that historically have kept women out of publication, have kept people of color out of publication, because they're maybe not citing the right people, citing people who are recognized. We maintained a pretty open process of collaborating with all of our authors. When we got to the point that we were working with Aggregate, that fit into their system. But I think that we felt, in general, with all three journals, there were ways in which each journal operated very, very differently. And in different ways, each of the three journals performed different kinds of exclusions, but different kinds of inclusions. So we were really trying to work with these different structures and test out this idea of feminist architectural histories of migration in multiple contexts. So that for us is one of the, I think, really unusual things about this collection that speaks to feminist practices, that speaks to migration as a method, and also that unseats what we typically think of as architectural histories. So it was very important to us to not just try this with two journals, but actually try this with maybe more than two and triangulate a process. Whether it works or not, we'll have to sort of see. This is our first launch of this collection, so we'll have to see how this rolls out and whether it does sort of impact the field. But I think we've heard from three different bodies of editors some different ways it's made them think differently about their own journals. We're grateful to them for their generosity in thinking these things through with us. But I think that, you know, we're sitting in an architecture school, and one of the reasons to speak of historical and theoretical scholarship in an architecture school is that we want many of these histories to become much more accessible to people who study in a school like this. It's very hard to do that. For example, a school like this in India, to use an example that, you know, is very an intimate example for me and Rachel, we both work there. Most people can't even access most scholarly publications. They're expensive. Even the online publications, there's a paywall that makes it impossible for articles to even be accessed. So these were some of the things that we were thinking about. Students want to be reading histories of the built environment from all over the world, and they can't even access these histories. So what they can access are histories of European traditional architecture. And this to us seemed like really something important to work against. It is a feminist practice in many ways. I mean, it's many different kinds of anti-colonial practice, but we thought this would be one way that we could test out doing this. And the multi-sided aspect of that, enabling a way of, you know, understanding positionality from multiple angles, is also something that we really feel came out in this film. That we have readers from all over the world reading each other's texts, and they're reading people from all over the world. I think, like, seeing Nidha read your article is just very meaningful to us. That your history is meaningful to her and her scholarship. So we really encourage you to look at these essays and also look up the work of the authors and also the readers. They're all really important people. And we think they've shown such an act of generosity in what they've done here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I think that was really helpful for me with, for instance, like thinking about questions of positionality, given that the method of working itself was not one that was extractive in terms of like the way that you're thinking about material, but it was collaborative in the whole process, which it's not that you're trying to replicate a certain position, but given voice to many different positions. I think Mary Lou, I saw her raise her hand. Oh, I think we have someone back here. I'm sorry, but then Mary Lou, presumably.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I guess my question is sort of piggybacking on yours, Jason, but maybe more to do with architectural practice itself. So, I mean, architecture is interesting because it is always, like, as a profession, it's always something that's quite collaborative, and like the process of building procurement is something that is often done collaboratively, but at the same time, the canon of architecture is often dominated by like fairly singular, usually like masculine figures, or whatever. And I guess my question would be,
you can say it's okay.
How you see maybe the potential for like collaborative spatial practice in your work, and what the importance of that is, and how you feel that may or may not help in like recoding feminist histories of architecture or as like, models for practice?
I think we heard it from Pamela in the architectural history of tampons. Well, I mean, that's a spatial practice.
So let me try to answer that. As I mentioned, I practice as well as I write, and a lot of my interest to rewrite the history of the city from individuals who usually are not at the drawing table or the policy-making boardrooms came out of a decade of working in practice in China, in the Chinese cities, and realizing that as an architect, I had learned more from the migrant workers and the villagers being displaced than from any other fellow architect or scholar and historian and policymaker and planner. And that realization came through out of a decade of work in an architectural practice, but one that I had aspired and eventually turned into, I think, an alternative form of practice. So the design work that I'm currently doing in Hong Kong and in mainland China are much more collaborative based, where we work rather than with a private individual client, we work with community organizations, NGOs, and indigenous villages, and create a process, what I call co-design. So this is where I would say that why I think history and theory and writing and reflection is very important, because for me is that the practice and understanding how things happen outside of the academia shaped the way I came back to academia. But then the decade and a half of writing and reflection helped me to go back to a practice that was very different from the one I had left. To be able to say, rather than just writing about the importance of collaboration and empowering individual voices, could I also shape a collaborative process in which, as a designer and practitioner, we work with individuals whom usually are not consulted during the design stage and design process. And shockingly, most of the times, the typical architectural practice do not engage the individual residents and community members, if you're thinking about, for example, in the cases of public housing and affordable housing. So I hope that answers your question of where I think that question came from. So I hope this is something that could be of interest to this architectural community here at Daniel's faculty, as well as in the practice communities of Toronto, to really work with all of us. I think there's a tremendous interest in Toronto, in Canada, and in this faculty to explore new ways of community engagement through design that allow us to leverage the latest, the best, and the most elegant designs, but to bring it to a group and within a context that beauty, elegance very often do not get discussed. So this is something that is, if you will, a little call to arms that I hope all of the students and scholars and community members and colleagues in this room and online to perhaps really understand that for me, there is no definite boundary between history and theory and practice. I think good theories are good based on good practices, and good practices are also based on evidence and history and the precedents that are being shaped.
maybe I could briefly add to that and talk about the sort of practice that I'm involved in at the TU Delft, where for the graduation studio projects, there are two mentors. There's a design mentor and there's a research mentor. And the students who are in particular studio where they develop their own research and design projects rather than following the briefs set by other studios, they are able to choose their own research and design team. And so due to this project and a sort of solidarity there among a group of academics and practitioners, there is a sort of feminist group, and we are quite visible, and I think there is a lot of interest within the student body in feminist approaches to design. And so I've been able to mentor students who have taken feminism seriously in their design projects and adopted a feminist approach to architecture within those projects. So that's a fantastic thing to be able to do.
Shai? Yeah. Thank you very much. It's amazing to hear this conversation. And it brings up so many things, especially within a school of design, that have to leap over parts of thinking. So from practice questions, how to what do you mean by feminism? And what do people assume feminism is? And the simplistic thing might be, well, it's collaborative work. Women's work is collaborative work, which is not feminism in some modes. So I would offer feminism is a politics of social relations, and that alleviates it of a gendered version in the first instance. So we don't have studios. I don't teach studios, so I can only assume what goes on when they think about community work at that. But that it starts to think, as I think the way that many of you are working, is a politics of social relations, where whether you're a historian or you're a designer, you're in a network of relationships that have various degrees, not hierarchies as so often in architecture and design professions, or even in architecture history and publication, as you've mentioned, of course, the peer review. And it's interesting that there's been no definition of it, just the examples of work, and of work through particular projects that show a kind of diversity in themselves of approach. And I think that's a long learning curve for architecture and design studios and design faculties like this, but particularly within architectural history and theory, which I really appreciate the way that Anooradha, you've spoken of it, and also Rachel in the last 2 days that we've had seminars and lectures, that you've resisted the kind of language that is the language of architectural history received. So what is women's work, which is usually the form that takes place in architecture? Women architects as opposed to feminist architects. A very gendered split, where you can be a feminist if your politics of social relations is what you're engaging. And I would offer that for comment. There's much more to be said, and I've thought of a lot of different ways of approaching what I wanted to ask you about, because the conversation is so rich and diverse. But I wonder, without asking for a definition, if we could talk about a politics of social relationships, because that alleviates us of all the binaries that come with it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you, Mary Lou. That's a really nice analysis also. And I think you point out something that has been a challenge for us as well, that perhaps we've defiantly taken on this word collaborations, because it is a feminized concept and an emasculated concept, that somehow collaboration is lesser, somehow it doesn't produce signature in the way that we want to see in any aesthetic endeavor or any kind of artistic or architectural endeavor. But I think that it has been important to us to recuperate collaboration as something that itself can be identity forming even as it is representative of multiplicities and social relations, as you say. But it's very helpful to have that definition in hand, because I think we were also talking as we were thinking about today, and just seeing the collection and the great stability that's formed by seeing the table of contents on a page, for example, which isn't the way the project has ever been. It's not like we set out to make something that's had a masthead in this way. But I think that we've really started to think about this problem of feminism. Surely there will have been authors in this collection who would never use this term to describe themselves. There would be authors for whom, you know, this term would be one they'd be allergic to. And there are other authors who take on the term very happily and willingly and use it in ways we can all relate to. There are authors who take on the word very happily and willingly and use it in ways we wouldn't relate to. So I think that some of what we felt was important was to center the problematic and to allow the reader to take on the problematic. I don't think we need to necessarily be prescriptive about what feminism is. And for us, I think in general, it's been an analytical term that describes every one of the works in the collection. But it's not a term that the authors necessarily gave to us. And they all do seem to have very different reasons for belonging in the collection. And it's been useful for us in a way not to define that, but allow it to be a kind of scaffold for thinking with this project. But I very much appreciate the definition you've put on the table, because I think it does actually describe all of these works and our own editing process.
It's thanks to Angela Davis.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing your time and work with us. I was just wondering that since stories of migration are sometimes particularly linked to the idea of loss, whether of the built environment, culture, or identity, or more importantly to the idea of resettlement, whether forced through state powers or constituted due to the lack of its sensitivity, what are the challenges you faced in critically understanding architecture, a discipline that is synonymous with durability and permanence from a standpoint of temporality?
Can you say that last?
Sorry, I'm saying that what are the challenges you faced in critically understanding architecture that is a discipline that is synonymous with durability and permanence from a standpoint of temporality?
Well, one of the challenges that we face, I think we've all faced, Juan, I don't know if you agree, when writing architectural histories of migration, is that migrants often don't have the same kind of archival traces as other people do, people who have maybe lived and worked in the same city their whole lives and established their reputations in that very sort of stable environment. Migrants are forced to sometimes pack very few possessions into a bag and flee for their lives. And it's also the case with some of the architects who I've studied in my work, that they were very limited in terms of what they could take with them, and how their biographies are traceable in archives. So I think in several of the essays that we have published in the collection, there's a sense of also a responsibility for creating archives through the work, through the research, and presenting them as a kind of a methodological approach, and also as a source for further research. So I think the issue of the archive is something that's very connected to writing feminist architectural histories of migration.
So When I set out to write this history of a city that everyone says is only 400 years, when everyone says it's a city that only has a 40-year history, I uncovered a 4,000 years history. But that uncovering of those sources came from the majority, what I cited in my work, would not be considered as the typical cited sources in archives. If they were in archives, they were in village archives. They were not in, say, the archives of libraries. So a lot of what I have cited and what has been produced in, say, the city of Shenzhen is very much a city of migration, because it grew from 300,000 to 20 million in 2-3 decades. That's not by birth, that is by migration. Every single person in places of power and places of dispower came from somewhere else. So I had to take on very different research method and consider what are credible sources and how to cite them. For example, I think it might be including a little bit of the article that is currently on Aggregate, but it's certainly in my book. One of the most important voice when I was writing about the Nail House and Zhanglianhao was a protest letter she wrote herself that she posted. She asked a neighbor's son to help her to post online that described her story of migration to the city and forced migration out of the city. And it was her appeal for help to the general public because she was facing imminent eviction. And her protest letter was widely circulated on all forms of social media. And the result was the exact opposite of what she thought she would receive. The result is that she received hundreds of thousands of criticism and slander and harassment. So and I would say her original letter and the harassment she received online through the social media channels also became my material, and I suppose through publishing my book became an archive. So this is where I think as architects, architectural historians and scholars, the forms of activism could be multiple means, and I like to think that for me, my action of deciding to write was when I realized my actions of urban planning and design couldn't change the minds of the entire city that at the time did not see value in the urban villages and did not understand the perspective from individual villagers, because they were really seen as that didn't deserve to stay in this modern city. They were seen as historical remnants that really shouldn't be there. So in my design projects, I was able to convince individuals. I couldn't convince the public and the mass media. But I hope through writing and having words that everyone can read and can understand, that eventually that could engender a cultural change. Because if we believe that architecture ultimately is a cultural production, if we don't engage in cultural change, then the entire architectural profession and discipline will forever be passive in that particular history, that we somehow keep insisting that we are autonomous and should deserve more of a say-so. So this is where I think whether it is a feminist practice or, as what Meredith has spoken about kind of dissecting the power dynamics, as architects and designers and planners, usually we are working with a particular power level in the city, and but as writers and scholars, hopefully we have more access to that, and eventually I hope that writing and scholarship can then influence practice and planning. But we need to have a deeper view of history and hopefully more patience, because hopefully what we're writing, all of us, and editing, organizing these years can help to shape a future for all of you, for the students, where you could enter practices more easily that could work with power structures. That's not just the top 1%. Does that make sense?
Maybe we could invite the publishers and editors to.
Sure. Maybe I'll address that question from a slightly different angle, but I think across many of the contributions to this project, there was this idea of maybe slowing time down in a sense and focusing not on grand structures or architectures that have stood the test of time, but just focusing on space-making practices in a moment. So I think there's also something to say about this idea of slowing time down a little bit and expanding what it means to make space and to construct a built environment. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional process of architecture making, but can also happen in moments of real intimacy and connection. Yeah.
Are we able to?
If Armaghan or Meredith, Pamela, please feel free to join in the conversation if you would like.
Sure. I mean, I
yes.
just have a few comments about whatever said so far and the questions. And I think as someone who really has this background in architecture and also women's gender and sexuality studies and teaching feminism in different forms and shapes every day, I would say that one of the main feminist ideas that I saw in this collaboration, and we hear the word collaboration a lot here, is like the care and ethics and emotional labor that I saw Anu and Rachel and of course like all the editors put in this process. So it was not only about how I can publish my work, but it was about how they care about my existence. They care about the history of women's in Iran. They care about untold stories and so on. So I think we sometimes forget that these are not like physical just productions of knowledge, but there's a lot of emotional labor going to the work from me who wrote the article when I was like reading all these archives and trying to fact check what was really happening in early 20th century Iran. I heard the stories from my grandmother and also reading novels and then reading the archives to see what was really happening. I was just puzzled and waited and cried and think again about what women are in there and minorities, because I talk about ethnic minorities in Iran as well, they are going through. So I think having like that feminist intersectional lens that not only talks about women's rights, but also women, gender, class, ethnicity, and so on was really important. And another thing that I wanted to mention about migration, and I would say that when I saw the call, I saw migration in multiple ways. Migration for me was someone, migrating from Iran, but at the same time, the local migration that happened to these women from traditional courtyard, inward oriented houses to these modern spaces that some of them, they didn't, resonate with these spaces. So it was like somehow local migration happening without them noticing it. It was local within that context. But of course, how these, stories or narratives, or what really happened during that period can become these, idea globally. And I know the global might not be a very good word to use, but transnationally, right? That we can share and learn from and so on. And we see maybe a recent story of that in current Iran. And I would say that this is the last point I promise. I would say that another important point that I saw in this, feminist architectural histories was about how we need to center situated knowledge, right? And situated knowledge that stems from indigenous people, women, people of color, and so on. And, that really helps us to move toward social justice, because as an architect, whether we are practicing it or we're just historicizing and theorizing, at the end of the day, it's about people, it's about users, and so on. So I think that was really important, that connection that we all need to make, so that we help the societies and communities to move toward more social justice. Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Armaghan, I want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. Can we thank you so much. Welcome to Daniel's faculty in Toronto virtually, and I hope we can welcome you to the school in person in the near future as well. Thank you so much for sharing your work, and your presence is very important. We have many Iranian students in the school. Most of them are women students, and we have had multiple conversations with them about the challenges they're facing and the challenges of their friends and family facing in Iran. Thank you for your courage and your willingness to share your work with us. And it's, I think what is currently happening as we speak in Iran is a very good demonstration why we need to do what we're doing, because it is happening in Iran in a very extreme form. But I would say the type of violence against women and girls happen everywhere. I was part of a session this morning organized at University of Toronto by the Center for Sexual Violence and Harassment Prevention. And one of the issues we spoke about is that very often it is not about sex, it's more about power. It is the disproportionate power by individuals, and very often that gets misunderstood, and therefore, Mary Lou, I again really refer to what you were talking about, the definition you gave of feminism, that it's not really about gender. Ultimately, it is about power. And for us, I think we all have a responsibility, as Armaghan was saying, that if we want to champion through various ways we do, whether it's through writing, teaching, practice, being a good neighbor, that we want to contribute towards a more just society. And in order to contribute to a more just society, we need to acknowledge that injustice do happen, and most often it is involving the imbalance of power. And these are the ways in which I think that motivate, I believe, all of our work. And the one aspect Armaghan was saying, that it is about people, I think that's another commonality from what I can tell from every single author in this collection is not about recentering women only, it's about recentering people at the core of what we do and why we're doing it, right? If we don't remember that, then what are we doing? For whom are we creating the designs for and the cities for? So that's, thank you again, Armaghan, for that reminder. And it comes to be very poignantly to me personally from my Iranian scholars, such as yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Meredith or Pamela, are you still there? Would you like to comment?
I'm still here and I actually have to go, but I wanted to say thank you to everyone. It's really been an honor to be a part of this conversation and to hear everyone's fantastic insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I've been enjoying the conversations, and it's been an honor to be part of this project. The process of getting involved in the review process in and of itself was a very interesting learning experience for me, and I'm very grateful to all the participants. I learned a lot from your projects. The one last thing that I want to add to this conversation about the notion of feminism and the role women can play in events and revolutions around the world or counter-revolutions is that we try and think of them not as victims or as marginalized people, but as people who are actually very, very exemplary and powerful. If you look at what's happening in Iran now, I think that you basically, it's like an open book of Michel de Certeau. I mean, you don't need to just sit down and think about Situationist International to learn about how people can actively engage in spatial practices. But just looking at what's happening on a daily basis in Iran on the ground by women and men is really, really informative. And that should be something central to our discussions, as opposed to something that is happening in the margins. It's not us, it's them. They have this backward government and so on and so forth. But something that can be very, very informative and central to all of our discussions in the classrooms and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela.
I think there was one more question.
Hi, my name is Sebastian. Thank you for bringing such a rich and important. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello.
You have to switch it up.
Oh. Hello. Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you for bringing such a rich and important topic to the school. My question is quite simple, but it's basically you talked a bit about accessibility in terms of being free and online. And I was curious how also another form of accessibility factored into your thinking, which is accessibility in terms of language. I think we all know that sometimes academic writing can be a little scary for some people. So I wanted to have some thoughts on how you approach that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, writing that is intended to be for audiences all over the world that then takes place in English is perhaps fundamentally inaccessible. So I think we have to acknowledge that. But on another level, it is accessible in terms of scholarship in academic institutions. And if a publication can do something very, very small by simply shifting the culture of academic institutions in different parts of the world, perhaps that's what we're trying to propose here. That there's just a very small shift that can take place, that somebody teaching in Chile can assign an article that can be listened to about a fishing village in West Africa. That, to me, that's a small way that we can do this work. There's a lot of different ways to talk about accessibility, and I think that it's a broad term also, but some of what we were also aiming for was also just about bringing stories into architectural history that really would be people-centered, as Juan has said, and really would be accessible for any reader, anyone with any interest in the built environment, and making scholarship that would be understood as scholarly, peer-reviewed material that would then also be accessible to ordinary readers who aren't necessarily trained and have PhDs and all that. So that's some of what we were trying to do. It's a little bit difficult to talk about it without everyone having read the whole collection. But if you were to look at the collection and see, I think you would see that it's written in really accessible language. But also the stories themselves are so centered on vibrant figures or centered on vibrant problems or images or objects. So they have something to kind of grab onto in that way as well. And I mean, Rachel has thought a lot more about some of the other accessibility issues, like the audio and the other things that you can say more about.
Yeah, I think that was part of our thinking in accommodating or letting this collection reside on different platforms, because they all offer different kinds of reach in terms of their target audiences and the accessibility. And so the articles that are published with the CCA are much shorter than the ones that are published with Aggregate, for example. And I think Alexandra made very sure that they are all written in a way that does make them very, very readable. Yeah, so that was important. And we, as the project grew and our ideas of accessibility also changed and developed, we started thinking more about other forms, other medial communication strategies for these articles. So that was the reason that we developed these read articles on the CCA platform as well, where the authors read their own articles, offering an oral transmission of the knowledge. And with the final collection of videos of readers reading the author's works, that was another sort of move in that direction that also supports the accessibility. So maybe by watching the videos, you can really get a bit of a fascination for the topic, and then delve deeper into the articles in a way that you wouldn't if the articles were presented alone. So we were interested. I've also heard feedback from students that students that I've worked with in Delft, that they really appreciated the format with the readings on the CCA platform. So yeah, I think this was something that we all learned from the process, that it does have an impact.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry, do you want to? Just one. I mean, I think this is also for PhD students in the audience. We are assigned articles, and they are so formidable, and we think of scholars as unassailable, and we think of an actual finished article as finished. We don't think of it as the beginning of a conversation. And so in some ways, hearing someone's own voice, reading their own words, is an invitation to be in a conversation with that writer. So the film that was made at the end really was also acting out this process of inviting someone to read your own work. Well, what do we do when we read? We often are sitting alone somewhere, but this was a way of having a real dialogue through reading, a literal dialogue through reading. And that's another form of accessibility. Accessing the actual scholar is in some ways a way of demystifying scholarship.
And yeah, maybe one thing I would just add is from the editorial perspective, I think I tried to keep my hand as light as possible. And I think it was more a question of dialogue or continual questioning with each author that contributed to the CCA web issue. And I think something that I was thinking about throughout the process of working with all of these authors and have continued to think about is just is the question of audience. So how can something be accessible for various different kinds of people? But also thinking about who, I don't know how to articulate this properly, but just like how much needs to be explained or how much needs to be made clear, like who is a text written for? And I think a lot of the time in some of the CCA articles, you'll find that maybe if you don't know the deep history of what's being talked about, maybe there are some things that you won't understand, but I think in not spelling everything out, it does invite a new audience in and allows a new audience to sort of feel comfortable with the work in a way that they maybe wouldn't if every single thing was really made quite explicit. So.
maybe I'll add one more comment before you can close. I really do believe that architectural writing, whether it's history, theory, or criticism, must move towards forms of understanding that it needs to be a public scholarship. Ever since I came back to North America in the past year and a half, I have heard many complaints by architects and architectural scholars lamenting on the growing irrelevance of architectural practice in shaping our cities. And there's many reasons for it, but I think we also need to look ourselves as a transnational collection of individuals in architecture, especially in architectural and design education, is that if we continue to write for our own small communities, architectural practice will be less and less relevant in shaping the larger decisions in the city and in the world. So that last question you have, I think it's very, very important, because I could understand you were talking about broader accessibility, but more specifically the language of the academia, the way in which architects write, the way in which architectural scholars write, or the way in which academics write, period, right? Not just architects, right? The way all academics write. And I would say that I was very fortunate in my first major writing project. I worked with an editor, ironically, from Harvard University Press, who had asked me to rewrite everything I wrote, saying, could you write it so that it's not only architects and urban planners who could understand? And I'm like, do you know how hard I wrote to make sure architects and urban planners both understand, because they do not speak the same language. They do not write in the same language. So the greater challenge she posed to me was to write intellectually but not academically. And that was something I really benefited from working with a very critical author who guided me at that time as in the early process of rewriting my entire book manuscript so that non-academics could also understand it, so that individuals who are not familiar with, say, Chinese history or modern Chinese history could also understand it. So there is that public scholarship in both ways. One is going beyond the academia, and the second is going beyond the boundaries of the discipline. That we need to write in ways that everyone should be interested in what we're writing, whether they're trained in anthropology or forestry.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists, to our friends online, and to you guys out there, our audience here, for joining us this evening. Speaking of forestry, our next event in the Daniels Faculty Fall 2022 public programming is called Resilient Urban Forests Require All Hands on Deck, Lessons from Ecology, Community Science, and Working Across Disciplines. So there we are. It will take place this coming Tuesday, November 22nd at 12:30 p.m. right here in the main hall of the Daniels building. So we do hope to see you there and the rest of our upcoming events this semester. Have a good evening in the meantime, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who joined us, and thank you for those of you who had the patience to sit and listen to a talk on history and theory of migration. I was saying that this was an experiment to see how many individuals in a school of 2,000 are interested. You passed somewhat of that, and not to say, it's not to say that to give any values to whether someone is interested in history and theory or not, but I hope this can be the beginning of conversations for people hopefully for us to really be able to discuss as a community here that words matter, history matters, theory matters, because they do contribute to the way in which we practice. Whether or not we realize it, it usually is not real time. It usually will be a generation, but it's so important. And I see a number of doctoral students in the audience. So hopefully this conversation was hopefully provocative for all of you in how you think you're working, and hopefully you can cite less French philosophers and more the authors who have contributed to works such as this collection. So thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Anooradha. Thank you to all of our editors who joined us, Alexandra in person and also online. Thank you very much.